Okay. So, one of the biggest effects that the Spaniards had on the natives was the bringing of disease over to the Americas, specifically smallpox, measles, and influenza. And it's not like they intentionally transferred these diseases. In an article that you guys read, hopefully you saw that, these diseases, the natives were just more susceptible to them. They hadn't had immunity to them. And they also culturally didn't realize that if somebody was sick, you should quarantine them. Instead, whenever somebody was sick, they would almost like huddle around them and try to take care of them, and then the disease just spread rapidly. And we believe that an estimated 90% of Native Americans died purely from disease. So we know sometimes there was some violence, but most Native Americans' deaths were from disease. And so this is a famous picture of Aztecs in Mexico suffering from smallpox. If you want to learn more, you can watch this video. It's on Khan Academy. And then if you want to learn more just about the Columbian Exchange, you can watch this crash course. It's really, really good. In terms of the Spanish colonies, we're going to look at how they governed them and then how they did labor in the Spanish colonies. So here you can see they broke them up into what's called viceroyalties. And what they do is the empire is so large, and obviously the monarchs of Spain can't come over and govern them in person. So they do just like all the other big empires did. They broke all their new territory into different regions or provinces, and they had a governor come rule over them. Their governors were called viceroys. So they call these viceroyalities. So you have the Viceroyalty of New Spain that was set up by Cortez. You have Viceroyalty of New Granada, New Castile, and then La Plata. And so they continued an aggressive campaign to expand their empire throughout the New World, and they used the pre-existing imperial structures, and then they sent viceroys or governors over to rule over the territory. Their goal was mostly to find gold, export resources back to Spain, and then convert any of the natives to Catholicism. And the whole rest of this lecture, we're going to talk about three forms of labor that were used in the New World to farm cash crops or to get silver or gold from the mines. And when we're looking at this labor, the reason the labor happens is with the Columbian Exchange, now there's a huge new supply and demand system. There's something that we're going to talk about later called mercantilism, where the Europeans are banking on getting these cash crops over to Europe so that they could either consume them and use them and eat them, or sell them in a trade market in Afro-Eurasia and make a profit. And all of this supply and demand is going to lead to a huge demand for a labor source to do all of the work. So the main products that we're going to be seeing that are demanded are silver and gold. This is a dye, just like indigo is a dye to dye clothing. This is like a really pretty magenta dye. The cacao bean or chocolate, sugar, cotton, tobacco, agave, which is another sweetener kind of like sugar, and then vanilla. And so one of the main things that was being exported throughout the time and that was making Europeans really rich from the Americas were precious metals, silver and gold. They actually found both silver and gold in the regions that they conquered. Gold, you wouldn't have to mine as much. Gold, they would typically search through like river basins and stuff and kind of try to sift out gold. But silver was typically in higher altitude areas and in mountains, and so they needed a group of people to work in the silver mines. It generated the most wealth for Spain. They found the most famous silver mountain in a city that they called Potosi, which was in Bolivia. And it increased this idea of mercantilism where the colonies are existing just pretty much for the benefit of the mother country. So you find these mines in Bolivia or in South America, but it's not the people in South America that are going to become rich. It's the people who colonized it, which is Spain. So Spain's going to become incredibly rich through this founding of silver. And when we're looking at labor systems, every labor system that we're going to look at is going to be what we call a coerced labor system. And you should write down that coerced just means forced. There's the first labor system we're going to talk about, the first one out of three, is called Mita. Mita was a system that already existed in the Incan Empire. Mita was used in Peru by the Incan Empire to do building projects or to maintain their road systems. So in the Incan Empire, they used this Mita system, and it was basically in every village or tribe that belonged to the Incan Empire. They were mandated or required to send their males to the Incan Empire, the Incan leader, and then those males were sent out to do work to maintain the Incan Empire, and they only had to work for about 2 to 4 months, and only once in every 7 years, and they even got paid a little bit. So this Mita labor system worked really, really well to maintain the roads and the infrastructure in the Incan system. Well, when the Spaniards learned about this, they said, oh, great, we can use this already existing labor system, and instead of having them build roads, we can just have them required to work for us, and we can send them into the silver mines to mine gold for us. So the Spaniards pretty much adopted the Mita system, but they're going to use the labor for their own riches. So it becomes this coerced or forced labor system where Incan villages had to send a percentage of their male population to do work in the silver mines for the Spaniards. And so the Mita system was taken as a use of, labor systems that were already there, but now it becomes almost like a forced slave-like system where these Incan tribes are forced to go and work in the silver mines. Work was not easy in the silver mines. A lot of natives died because of breathing conditions, mercury poisoning, and it was just very, very hard work. Sometimes mines would collapse. So this system was not good for the Incan people. It's going to lead to a lot of death. It's very, very dangerous work. Silver, however, becomes one of the first traded global commodities or worldwide commodities at the time. It's taken from the silver mine to the coast, and then Spanish galleons, Spanish ships, are going to ship them either back to Europe, and then from Europe it's going to be used in Spain or traded throughout Afro-Eurasia, or it's going to be taken across the Pacific, and it's going to be traded with one region that really, really wanted silver, and that region was China. China had tried using paper money. I don't know if you remember flying cash. It didn't work. It would fly away. And they wanted to go back to a system where they were using metal coins, but their mines, their copper and bronze mines, were running low. So they're going to really, really want access to this silver. And the Spaniards are going to take silver over to China and trade it for Chinese luxury goods like silk, tea, and porcelain. China would demand access to that silver, and eventually it became China's main form of currency, including the fact that Chinese now had to even pay all their taxes in silver. Silver was one of the few things that China wanted. Spain was able to pretty easily take silver to China because they had already explored that way. You don't necessarily need to know this explorer, but he's pretty famous. His name was Ferdinand Magellan, and his task from the Spanish monarch was to find a Spanish way to the Indies. We know that Portugal went around Africa and went into the Indian Ocean and then to the Indies. Magellan tried to go around South America, over the Pacific Ocean, and then make it to the Indies. And his journey, his fleet was successful in doing that. They made it all the way home. Unfortunately for Magellan, he landed on a group of islands in the Pacific, and he figured they would treat him just like the Spaniards were treated in the Caribbean, and he was wrong. He got off the boat in the Philippines and started walking towards the people who lived there, and they started throwing spears and shooting with bows and arrows, and they ended up killing Magellan. The rest of his crew, some died, and then some ran back to their ships and quickly left and started sailing around. Spain eventually is going to get back to the Philippines, and they're going to conquer the Philippines. And that's really the only area that Spain takes in the Pacific. However, they use that to be like a jumping off point to trade with China and India. So here's the silver trade. You can see silver is going to come from here, and then it either goes to China or it goes across to Spain and then throughout Afro-Eurasia. The major resource used in the Spanish colonies were, however, agricultural. And they were coming from a lot of these islands here that had a good climate for growing crops, and a lot of Central America, and then a little bit of the region of Mexico. And the first labor system that they're going to use in these agricultural areas is called the encomienda system. On the encomienda system, you use a large plantation that they called a hacienda. It was this large plantation with a lot of farmland to grow cash crops. Encomienda was a system, a Spanish labor system in the New World that's kind of exactly like European feudalism. I want you to put in your notes that it's like European feudalism. And what it does is the Spanish monarch is going to give land grants to Spaniards to go and settle specific territories of land in the New World. And then on that land, those people are also granted with a number of Native Americans who would be doing labor for them. And so that labor was indigenous Americans doing the labor. The encomenderos, or the Spaniards, were charged with protecting the natives from pirates or anybody invading and converting them to Catholicism. And then in return, the natives would work the land and give them part of what they worked. And so this is exactly like European feudalism, just seen in the New World and using indigenous labor. And what they were supposed to do, you could see here, it looks just like a manor, like you learned from feudalism. They were told by the Spanish monarchs to treat the natives well. They all converted the natives. They did like mass baptisms to convert the natives to Catholicism. And then they viewed the natives as like precious sheep to look over and to take care of. But some Spaniards were treating them horribly. And so in the next clip, I'm going to show you like a couple of videos of someone reading this letter. This is a famous letter that was sent by a friar, a Catholic, who was sent over to the New World to convert people to Catholicism. And when he was there, he saw how horrible some of the encomenderos, or the landowners, were treating the natives. When he sent this letter back to the King and Queen of Spain, they're going to send millions of letters and laws back to the New World telling the Spaniards, you need to stop treating the natives like you're treating them. So here's some quotes, and then I want to play these videos so you can see what he's going to read out, some of these quotes.
Yet into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days, killing, terrorizing, afflicting, torturing, and destroying the native peoples, doing all this with the strangest and most varied new methods of cruelty, never seen or heard of before, and to such a degree that this island of Hispaniola, once so populous, having a population that I estimated to be more than 3 millions, has now a population of barely 200 persons. Yet into this sheepfold, into this land, low, wide gallows on which they hang victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13 in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, then set burning wood at their feet and thus burn them alive. When tied to the stake, the cacique, or chieftain, Hatway, a very important noble, was told by a Franciscan friar about the God of the Christians and of the articles of faith, and he was told what he could do in the brief time that remained to him in order to be saved and to go to heaven. The chieftain, who had never heard any of this before, and was told he would go to hell, where if he did not adopt the Christian faith, he would suffer eternal torment, asked the Franciscan friar if Christians all went to heaven. When told that they did, he said he would prefer to go to hell.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So when the monarchs got this letter, they outlawed slavery of Native Americans. And by 1542, the encomienda system was completely abolished. But the demand for goods was not abolished. So they needed to find a new form of labor. They tried to use Europeans to labor, and Europeans were lazy and they couldn't get enough of them to come over. They couldn't use natives anymore. And so they looked to a pre-existing system that existed with the Portuguese on the west coast of Africa, and that system was African slavery. the slave trade is initially going to be controlled by the Portuguese, and the Spanish crown is going to issue licenses to some of their own merchants to start trading slaves across the Atlantic and bringing them to the New World. And this new system of slavery, I know that you guys know what slavery is, but we're going to call the system of African slavery a term called chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is a type of slavery where people are treated as if they are a commodity or someone's personal property. And that person owns them and buys them and sells them as commodities. The vast majority of the slaves that we're going to be looking at in this time period are going to be working in agricultural settings, and it's mostly going to be on sugar plantations in Brazil and on the Caribbean islands. Both of those combined are going to bring in about 6 million slaves from West Africa. And if you just want to add into your notes or on one of your maps, we know that Brazil was given to Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas, and around 1500 they're going to start to colonize Brazil, and at the same time we see the Spaniards building their huge empires in Mexico, the Caribbean, and the west coast of South America. You do not need to write this down. This is just an example of the number of slavery. So Brazil starts importing slaves slowly, and then by the end of their colonial age, around the 1800s, they're going to have 4 million slaves in Brazil. In the Spanish colonies in 1501, the first slaves are going to be brought into the island of Hispaniola. The Spanish are going to purchase them from Portuguese merchants who are going to bring them from West African kingdoms, and they're going to bring them to these new colonies. With the increased dependency on this coerced or forced labor, the slave trade is going to bring about a lot of racial ideologies in Europe, where they start to determine why it's justified to be using this African labor source. And we're going to look at that really in the next time period with some texts about how Europeans felt about this. And the slave labor was not easy. We're going to watch some videos and stuff to look at different forms of slave labor. With this, we see this new trade network called either the transatlantic trade, meaning across the Atlantic, or triangular trade. So you should know it as both names, transatlantic trade and triangular trade. It's this trade network of sea routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas with the exchange of goods, ideas, and people. And you guys have a map where you drew the Columbian exchange trade route. I want you on that map to somehow add in this triangular trade. And here's what happens. In the New World, you have raw materials that are being grown and harvested on farms. Those raw materials are sent to the New World, those raw materials from the New World are sent to Europe. Europe is going to make manufactured goods and trade those manufactured goods for slaves on the West African coast. Slaves are going to be sent across the Atlantic to this New World to work on the agricultural farms that are going to farm the raw materials that are sent to Europe for goods that are traded with African kings for slaves, who are then sent over again for the agricultural work. So it becomes this cyclical process that just is never ending. And the worst part of it is this passage across the Atlantic called the Middle Passage. That's the Middle Passage where slaves are transported on ships to go to the New World to farm raw materials. So each leg carried an important piece of the cycle. From Europe to Africa, you have manufactured goods. Kings in Africa are going to want these manufactured goods like guns, and so they're willing to trade people in Africa to go over to the New World. From Africa to the Americas, it's known as the Middle Passage, where we're transporting slaves from Africa to work on agricultural plantations. And then from America to Europe, they're transporting raw materials to be made into manufactured goods. And some of the main things that African kings wanted were guns and rum. So here's the triangular trade system. If you want to use one of these maps, you can use this to help you draw on your trade route map. The impact on Africa. Europeans are going to manipulate a lot of the tribal communities and a lot of the political institutions where Africans are starting to form kingdoms and wanting to expand. So a lot of African kings, not a lot, I would say a few large African kingdoms are willing to raid their neighbors and take them into slavery to in exchange for these European goods. It increases the wealth of a few kingdoms. We're going to look at these when you guys come back from break. We're going to do like a case study on these kingdoms to see how they expanded through the slave trade. Um, we see a couple issues in Africa because of this. With a lot of the men being taken for the slave work, it was a lot of African men being taken. There became a huge gender imbalance on the west coast of Africa, where a lot of tribes are left now with like only women and they can't continue to populate their areas. We also see the introduction of firearms to a group where we see power struggles. And so a lot of violence and conflict is going to happen in Africa because of this quick introduction of firearms. So here are some of the kingdoms that are going to trade a lot of slaves there. And then you guys know Kingdom of Congo down there is going to be one of those regions too. So I'm going to play this video, and when I'm done,